Uh-oh, that boy's 12 posting again. I've already made a couple videos examining the interesting landscape that the Big 12 is set to find themselves in at the beginning of the next athletic season, with a focus on the new conference's many rivalries. I've bemoaned the schedule structure, I've talked about wheat and corn, and considered the possibility of another manufactured rivalry between two scorned lovers in OSU and Tech. And while I'll still be making videos about rivalries for a while, I'd hope, I still can't help but think about the concept of those rivalries that will inevitably be created during the Big 12's time with 16 teams. There's just so many interesting and unique schools in conference right now, with only 4 or 5 legitimate historical rivalries to point at. So to keep that conversation going and to sort of return to that easygoing, just talk it out style of video I use for the schedule video that a few of you seem to enjoy, I decided I'd make a tier list of some of the rivalries in the new Big 12 and see if I can spurn some discussion from there or not. So obviously, since this is my opinion and I'm not an expert on these schools, I'm going to get some things terribly wrong. So if you're a fan of one of these schools and would like to give some insight on these rivalries and what you think might happen, go ahead and start a discussion in the comments. I'm genuinely interested here because the Big 12 is going to be sort of like a litmus test for whether or not new rivalries can be formed in the modern era. So let's go ahead and get started with the rivalries Wikipedia mentions on the Big 12 page, since these ones are the most apparent. I'll get these ones out of the way first. Our only 4 S-tier rivalries are the 4 that are being protected. Holy War with BYU and Utah, Duel in the Desert with Arizona and Arizona State, Sunflower Showdown, of course, K-State and KU, and the Rivalry, or the Bluebonnet Battle, but nobody calls it that. That's TCU and Baylor. These are the ceilings for rivalries in conference, I think. But Wikipedia does list some others, so let's go ahead and go down that list. First up, Arizona, Texas Tech. This one has some history, if you remember, with the old border conference where Arizona and Tech, they were both members for a handful of years. Some of those games apparently got a little testy. But if you go back in time and look at the overall record with these two teams, there really isn't much to go after there. Last time these two teams played was in 2019. Arizona won. Tech won a majority of the games before that. It's just been so long since there was really anything of substance here. I'm going to go ahead and give this rivalry a D-tier rating. I don't think it'll come up much worth of anything. Yes, they're both desert schools, but that doesn't really mean much. There's no bad blood here, and I can't really imagine that changing. Next is Baylor, Texas Tech, otherwise known as the Texas Farm Insurance Shootout, or my personal favorite, the Butt Bowl, since the Baylor logo right in front of the Tech logo makes it look like it spells butt. Yeah, these teams have played each other quite a bit. Lots of history, stretches multiple conferences. I don't think it's the strongest rivalry in the conference, but it's a nice, maybe backbone style one, if you get what I mean. Sort of keeps the old spirit of the Southwest alive, where every Texas team absolutely hated each other. I don't think it'll ever reach the scope of some of the other rivalries, though, so it's C tier. After that, Cincinnati, UCF. This is kind of an interesting one since it's really new. These teams only started playing each other in football, I think, in 2015. So given it's so short, it's kind of capped. But man, does this rivalry burn. Since Cincy lost Louisville as their main in-conference rival in the American, UCF was kind of their largest, most annoying peer. They're more than glad to throw the war on I-4 away for Big 12 membership, so they're now without a primary rival in conference. Now look, I've spoken to Cole Adams about this for the last video. This is really the only rivalry Cincy fans consider at this point, even with West Virginia right there. They were the biggest fish in the small pond that was the American, so they're kind of still wrestling for position in this new conference. They're C tier, but it could grow eventually. Speaking of Cincinnati, West Virginia, this is an old Big East rivalry. If you look at the football win percentages, it really doesn't seem like it'll ever become much of a new one. And like I said earlier, my friend Cole Adams mentioned that Cincy fans don't really care too much about the Mountaineers right now. I'm sure that feeling's mutual. But I think due to their proximity and, funnily enough, their basketball programs, I think this could eventually become the primary rivalry in conference for both of these schools. Sort of like how Colorado-Utah was quote-unquote rediscovered when those two schools joined the Pac-12. I think this is going to end up maybe being the same thing, if not as forced, honestly. So I'll tentatively put it in B tier, expecting it to get there eventually, if not soon. By the way, with Colorado-Utah, does either fan base really care about the Rumble and the Rockies? I mean, I know it goes back to both schools in the Skyline or the Rocky Mountain Conference, or whatever they were back in the 40s before Colorado joined the Big Eight. Like, it has a rivalry. Don't get me wrong. They've played each other a whole bunch throughout their history. Utah leads the series by only 3 games, whatever. But it still feels like this is more of a friendly rivalry than anything else. Colorado hates Nebraska way more. Utah hates BYU way more, so on and so forth. From what I've heard from fans of these programs, and this is purely anecdotally, so it could change from person to person, but from what I've heard from those fans, this really isn't so much of a rivalry as much as it is a friendly game that sometimes gets tense, like K-State, Oklahoma State, almost. It's D tier. Colorado K-State, though, is an interesting one. I've seen a few Colorado fans online, like Reddit and Twitter and stuff like that. They're excited for this one because, as you can imagine, the 90s were kind of bitter between these two schools, with Colorado coming off their national championship and K-State deciding that they wanted to be good under Bill Snyder. So you kind of have to ignore the record pre-Snyder, which is the case for just about everything K-State, actually. But the mentality between these two programs has really shifted, with Coach Sanders taking over CU and the culture becoming more pro-like and player-centric, as opposed to K-State under Kleiman, which has been more blue-collar, ground and pound, that sort of thing. I think it'll be an interesting game for both schools, and it might develop there at some point, but I'm not sure it'll ever beat out Iowa State for K-State's second rivalry. It's D tier. Houston Tech is another example of one of those old Southwest rivalries that I just don't think really carries too much into the new Big 12. Houston's kind of lost out there on the gridiron at the moment. They're getting a new head coach, that sort of thing. And while I think Houston's going to create some enemies in basketball, I think they're going to make some enemies with everyone in basketball, just like KU does. So I think this is going to be our first F-tier rivalry. I'm going to need some insight from some Texans, though, just to be sure, because they'd know better than I would. But it really, just from the online presence between the two fan bases, it really doesn't seem like there's much there right now. Farmageddon. I've made an entire video on this game. Shouldn't have to go over it again. Long story short, it was a meme in 2009 that quickly became not a meme because of Twitter and close games. It's A tier. The last of the existing rivalries is Texas Tech TCU, otherwise known as the West Texas Championship, even if Fort Worth is literally on the eastern half of the state. I've thought about making a video on this game for a while, but I wanted to wait to make videos on other rivalries outside the Big 12 first. I don't want to just be making rivalry videos about the Big 12. It's also called the Battle for the Saddle, which is a really cool trophy to give to these two teams. It's just a saddle with the winners on either side of it. Very cool trophy. Not so much hyped up or with the same level of vitriol as some of the other rivalries in this conference, though. So as much as I'd love to give it A tier, I just can't see it developing that much further than B tier. Yes, the history's there. Yes, the trophy's awesome. I just don't really see there being much reciprocation in this rivalry, as there probably was some time ago. All right, so now we're done with the rivalries Wikipedia has listed. So we're just going to go with a few that I can think of off the top of my head. Not all of them will be on here, of course. Just a few that make sense to at least talk about. We'll start with the Dust Bowl / Xerox Bowl / Western Gunfight that is Oklahoma State and Texas Tech. I've banged the drum for this game. I can see the conference banging the drum for this game. But the comments on the video I made on it seem fairly impartial either way. They're too similar with not much antagonism on the history to make it worth it. It's a D tier right now. I'd love to see it develop into C tier or B tier or even A tier somewhere down the line. But we'll see. Maybe I'll put it at an average spot. I don't know. The Space Race, Houston and UCF. Man, it just makes so much sense with the NASA histories of both UCF and the city of Houston, the rockets at the football field for UCF, all that. The only problem is Neither of these two fan bases care about each other. They are just another team to play. like yes, it's too perfect to not be a rivalry, but Houston and UCF don't really have a lot of history, and the history they do have isn't competitive. This rivalry is unfortunately F tier because it flat out does not exist. BYU Baylor is another example of a rivalry that doesn't really exist. You know, Baylor was kind of BYU's welcome party to the Big 12 a couple years ago when their addition was, just recently announced after out. They had that kind of game early on in the season, and the fan bases were just so kind and cordial to each other. It really didn't even feel like a game. It felt like a parade almost. Whatever the opposite of a rivalry is, that's this game. It's F tier. Riot Bowl, West Virginia, Iowa State. This isn't a rivalry. It's just a name given to a game between two fan bases that earn the nickname. It's F tier. The teams don't really care about each other. The nickname's in jest. It's all in good fun, all that. They're another game that's almost, more like they're friends than anything else. Like, the Mountaineers are capable of so much hatred, as we can see in the Backyard Brawl. It's just they're so out of place in the Big 12 of old that it makes way more sense for them to gravitate towards Cincy or even UCF than any of the teams in conference right now. Iowa State's included in that. Last one I'll mention is Colorado, Texas Tech. This was an afterthought in the old Big 12, given the division split between North and South. But there's actually a possibility that, given the Western location and the differences between fan bases and the lack of a real number one in-conference rival for both of these schools, this naturally becomes the game that gets scheduled for both of these programs. Is it likely? I don't know, but it's been mentioned in my comment sections enough that I think it's worth at least thinking about. D tier for now, since I can see those games immediately becoming testy. It could be explosive in the future, or it could be a nothing burger. We'll just have to see. So what did we learn from this? Well, the main thing is that the Big 12 really doesn't have that many rivalries of note at the moment. I'm sure half the country doesn't even really know that the Revivalry is a thing, and I have that as an S tier for scaling. But again, like I mentioned in the scheduling video and like I mentioned in the OSU Tech video, the Big 12 is really in an interesting place as a conference because there are so many opportunities for us to watch rivalries grow and be born organically in 2024 onward, right? Like, so many of us see rivalries as these ancient traditions that are reborn 1 week out of every year, and it kind of seems like it's impossible for new ones to be made sometimes. And the Big 12 is going to be the guinea pig for whether or not it's possible to create new rivalries in this ever-changing modern world of college athletics. So what'd you think of my tier list? I'm really only a K-State guy, so my knowledge on other programs is pretty surface level, just observatory from what I see fans of other teams saying online or stuff like that. So if you've got any inside anecdotes as a fan of one of the Big 12 teams as to who the fan base likes, who the fan base doesn't like, where those lines have been drawn hard in the sand and all of that, be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you're not a Big 12 fan, and you're kind of watching this conference sort of solidify and really become the Gen Z of college conferences, what are your thoughts as an outsider? I know I have a lot of fans from SEC country who probably couldn't give a lesser rip about the Big 12, so I'm sure there are some thoughts there. Whatever it may be, remember to be kind in the comments, be safe in the new year, and hey, have a great break while you got it. I'll see you next time.